All right, let's talk about political aesthetics, the subdiscipline or the discipline. I don't know what it would be a subdiscipline of. Political science, or yeah, I think so, or philosophy, philosophical aesthetics. But since it's probably properly neither a subdiscipline of those disciplines, maybe it's its own discipline. All right, here's the book I wrote, published in 2010 from Cornell, of that title, Political Aesthetics. It's not that 1,000 people hadn't already been reflecting on these kinds of things, but I tried to name a discipline and sort of get sort of underpinning taxonomies, basic issues, a range of fundamental examples into place. In other words, to bring it from maybe a more impressionistic or sidelight area of inquiry to a central, explicit dimension of reflection. All right, so let's see. What is political aesthetics? I mean, for one thing, we could talk about the centrality of images and non-textual items to politics. Just take a couple of more recent examples. I mean, I was working on this in the 2000s as I transitioned from being a professor at an art school, MICA, in Baltimore, to being a professor of political science at Dickinson College in Carlisle. I mean, basically, the reason I kept shifting disciplines, political science, art history, philosophy, communications, is just because I had a hell of a struggle with the career. I did whatever I had to do to stay employed, I guess, including switching disciplines. But, so how about this image right here? This just happened a couple weeks ago. And that image was everywhere. And people started calling me to try to figure out what the hell this thing means or what images do in politics. I guess because I wrote that book back then. Of course, I don't think it got enough attention, and I think it will or might. If I am remembered for anything, it might be this, as people get it on board. All right. Of course, everything might be forgotten. All right. This is back in 2010. It's not exactly going to be the first reference you run into, maybe. Okay. So, but anyway, a lot of my citations now are coming from this book. At any rate, let's talk about what political aesthetics is. The way I thought of it is it's an attempt to use the conceptual equipment developed in philosophical aesthetics, the philosophy of art and beauty, and apply it to the data of political science. That is, to political systems, constitutions, ideologies, policies, even campaigns. Now, I mean, I have a series of, I guess, fundamental assertions. All right, so here's a couple of fundamental purposes of political aesthetics. One is to stop thinking about political ideologies, constitutions, systems, even legal systems, as primarily textual, as formulated above all in text. A political system, ideology, is formulated, it's like an interdimensional aesthetic being. That's the phrase I use, a phrase I use in the introduction. That is, a political system like, let's say, the American system of the early republic. It's got text, all right. It's got that Declaration of Independence. It's got that Constitution, and a bunch of other stuff, the Federalist Papers and so on. It's also got buildings. It's got cityscapes, like the architecture of Jefferson. It's got cityscapes. Okay. It's got pictures. It's got cartoons. Its texts have poetic aspects, right? The quality of the sound and so on. And even the fonts, things like this. The Constitution of the United States that is a textual item, right? But the Constitution of the United States, the way the whole thing is put together and what it means and what we are is a multi-dimensional aesthetic being. I think you can get Jefferson's republicanism as much from his buildings as from his writings, and I think he thought of it that way. I apologize for saying Jefferson, all right? But the thing is, though, whether you like Jefferson or not, you can say this about almost any system, okay? You can say this about any system, right? Any political system. It's not just a matter of verbal formulation or publishing texts, okay? It's a presentation in all media all the time. So to understand even the nature of a political system, we got to get moving off the text, man, and moving on to non-textual modes of political formulation. And of course, these are active all the time. I mean, these account for many of the effects of political communications. The non-textual are not directly like semantic properties, the aesthetic properties. So political aesthetics would move off of text, although kind of refocusing on the aesthetic qualities of text, and move on to the other modes of political formulation or other media of political formulation. All right. Now, it might seem that, I guess, a lot of people try to kind of characterize the textual aspects of an ideology, for example, as its intellectual aspects, its true or false bit. Okay, its semantic part. Whereas the images, the films, the paintings, and things like this, whatever it may be, the buildings, are conceived of as propaganda, like as emotive, in a way that the text is cognitive and the image is emotive. All right. One thing I argue in here and many other places, that's really simplistic and really false because the text is emotive and the image is cognitive. Certainly the building is. In fact, the text might be a bunch of bullshit, right? So look at the environment, all right? There's what the Soviets say, and then there's the world the Soviets create, the built environment they create, the aesthetic world. Now, which of those is the reality of the political system? Well, you definitely aren't going to be able to describe it without describing the form that is created. I mean, I guess very roughly, I could talk about the aesthetic aspects of something as aspects that could be relevant to whether it's beautiful or not. These are ways to try to pick out what the aesthetic aspects of something are, like the aesthetic aspects of a political system. Or we might think of the aesthetics of something as picking out qualities of its form, right? Its shape. There's the meaning of a sentence, and then there's the shape and sound of the sentence. Now, those two things are inseparable for reasons that many thinkers have explored and that I agree with. But the emphasis on form is part of this move into the aesthetic dimension. All right. And of course, even though, like I say, I don't want to disregard this as like a mode of propaganda or something like that. Like every image, every film, every song that has political content as political propaganda. It's not, okay? Not any more than all the words are. If all the images are mere propaganda, all the words are too. Okay, I guess I want to say. But they're not. Okay, I mean, either of those things can be used propagandistically, and either of them can be used cognitively to express the truth. So, another real quick objection I want to get out of the way, but it's considered throughout the book, I guess, is that the aestheticization of politics, or thinking about politics as aesthetic, is itself totalitarian or Nazi. Walter Benjamin, in Work of Art of the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, should I say Benjamin, argues exactly that. What the Nazis have is the aestheticization of politics. And the Nazis did aestheticize politics, like more intensely, as intensely as anyone ever has. But there's no political system that doesn't have an aesthetics, or doesn't have many aesthetics. Right? Because everything has an aesthetics. Insofar as, for example, everything has a form, right? Everything could be looked at with the question of its beauty in mind, for example. Everything could be looked at, or lots of things could be looked at with the question of what do they represent, or what can they be used to represent. Those are aesthetic questions, it's questions of representation. So if representation is an aesthetic question, and it's the basic question of philosophical aesthetics in the ancient world, for example, in Plato's Republic, then aesthetics and politics are closely connected insofar as representation and politics are closely connected. What does it mean for someone to represent someone else, or much less a population or something like this? Or what images, flags, emblems can represent a people, and what does that mean, and what are the problems? All right, and what are the uses and the abuses of beauty in the world of politics? All right, obviously, these are very central questions, or I sort of want to say these are the central questions of politics. Furthermore, I think even with regard to the truth of basic political assertions, there's often an ignored or blinked aesthetic dimension that's relevant. I wouldn't say that aesthetics is irrelevant to the question of whether politics is true or not, because aesthetics is a way of perhaps covering up the falsity, or it's a way of expressing the truth that makes truth possible. That is, that not in the sense that there's a truth out there that we're groping to express and then suddenly we have, but that a truth comes to be embodied in a poem or a document in some way, and the truth of it cannot be separated from its beauty or from its aesthetic qualities. But at any rate, it's not only totalitarian systems that attend to the aesthetics of politics, because there's aesthetics wherever there's politics. The Marxist systems, the anti-Nazi systems, and I think this is partly because they were anti-Nazi, and this is partly why they were anti-Nazi. They were against aesthetic politics. The Marxist systems, the materialist systems, right? You don't want pretty pictures. And if there is any art involved, it's going to be manipulative propaganda art that will help us all pull together, or whatever the rhetoric is. Right? Well, and so that we're actually making almost intentionally ugly built environments, for instance, because we're expressing our utilitarian devotion to practical purposes, and we're associating ornamental frippery with the bourgeoisie and the aestheticization of politics with the Nazis. But rejecting aesthetics in politics is an aesthetics of politics. You just designed all those housing blocks, right? Same with the American housing projects, which had a Stalinist flavor in the 50s and 60s. Well, they are designed, okay? You made aesthetic choices. And if you were rejecting aesthetics, that ended up making your environment look a certain way, okay? So there is no escape even in rejecting. And, while there's totalitarian aesthetic politics, there's liberatory aesthetic politics, of course. One of my favorite examples, just because everyone knows it and I can just say it and that's it, is Bob Marley. Okay, Bob Marley. Yeah, too bad about what frat boys like Bob Marley. But he also brought Rastafarian liberatory politics to the whole world. Or I talk about anarchist politics and the centrality of anarchism to modernism, especially in New York in the early 20th century. Arthur Dove, for example, and Emma Goldman, but many others, all right. Or the anarchist politics of punk. Every politics is an aesthetic environment. That's why this is a fundamental discipline. I don't know if science can get you to anything in politics, really. Probably, maybe, I don't know. But aesthetics can get you to most of politics. All right, so just to, I guess this is a hyper brief. And also, I guess I think that right now, people are really worried about this. I'm not sure exactly why. It is 15 years after I worked on this book, okay? But people are seeing this now. And suddenly people are calling and emailing me. Did you write this book? Okay, so let's talk about the Trump image. Or let's talk about the Last Supper at the Olympic opening ceremony, etc. People are seeing this now, which is not surprising. It is everywhere. So anyway, here are a few ways I characterize the discipline of political aesthetics. It's on page 11 of the book, just provisionally. Political aesthetics, I say, treats political systems, constitutions, ideologies, as aesthetic environments rather than as primarily composed of textually expressed doctrines. I was just talking about that. 2, considers textual materials themselves in their aesthetic aspects, their poetic aspects, or their anti-poetic aspects, right? Which are also, if a text has no poetry, specifically refuses poetry, like any decent bureaucratic text, those are aesthetic aspects that can be described and that are important to their effects. Political aesthetics strategically starts by questioning and exploring the distinctions between fundamental dimensions of value, such as truth, that is epistemic value, goodness, moral value, justice, political value, and beauty, aesthetic value. I focus on the ways these things overlap. For example, justice and beauty. I don't think you could understand justice without understanding aesthetic dimensions of justice. But who talks about that exactly? Well, let's see, Elaine Scarry and others have, but not John Rawls maybe, but we need to. Why do you want that balance? Why does fairness attract? It has something to do with symmetry, right? It has something to do with the composition of a human society. All right. Political aesthetics concerns the design of political systems, not the politics of design systems. I'm not interested in, today on how stuff gets into the museums or how the pecking order of artists, the politics of the art world. I'm interested in the art of the politics world instead. So it concerns the design of political systems, not the politics of design systems. Asserts that political aesthetics asserts that not all art is political. I don't think it is. You can have a lot of other reasons to do art, but even though every work of art has a political location or several, but not political content necessarily. But all politics is aesthetic. Not all art is political, but all politics is aesthetic. Political aesthetics asserts that aesthetic and other values, epistemic and ethical, for example, intersect at every actual political site. So the aesthetic aspects are available to be described and are significant to the meaning at every political juncture. And finally, suggests a token identity between aesthetic and political systems at a given time and place, but rejects a type identity between style and ideology, for example, between classicism and republicanism. This cryptic remark, I say, is clarified in the book's conclusion. But yeah, okay, so the fact that, sort of Jeffersonian classicism or neoclassicism is the style of the American and the French revolutions might make you say that classicism and republicanism are joined or are the same thing or are the same ideology. However, the Nazis used classicism too. For example, classical tropes are everywhere in all kinds of political systems. This is characteristic. Like the style does not have a set eternal meaning. It can be turned in different directions. And yet the content of the style is relevant at each juncture to what the thing means. And the fact that Jefferson's classicism gives you kind of a relatively modest size Monticello, whereas Nazi classicism gives you, let's tear down Berlin and build it again. Gigantism. This is what Albert Speer said about his own classicism. Like, I didn't realize that it was dementedly gigantic. And that means that contradicted itself, the classical mode. Anyway, so you got to get into the details. It's not a matter of just saying like, oh, this style is Nazi, and this style is anarchist or something. Like, it's the relation of aesthetic and verbal or ideological formulation is really quite complex in interesting ways that we can do a whole histories. Art political histories. All right. I guess that's my little introduction or reintroduction of political aesthetics. Now for the 2030s.